Next, we'll talk about utilitarianism. In contrast to deontology, where actions have intrinsic values and are the only thing that matters, utilitarianism does not care about the act at all. Actions do not have an intrinsic value. Utilitarianism is a consequentialist approach, meaning that only the consequences matter. Whether an act is right or wrong, I should say ethical or unethical, depends solely on whether harm or good resulted from the action. This raises the question, what consequences are good and what consequences are bad? What are we looking for? Well, we are looking for consequences that affect the society as a whole, that promote human well-being, such as health, dignity, integrity, freedom, respect for all people affected. Now, you may say, but I got you there, being respectful and having integrity seems like a universal law. And guess what? You're correct. Those are universal laws. But remember, deontology argues that it has an intrinsic value. You have to have integrity, period. Utilitarianism does not care how you get there. You can kill a whole bunch of people to have integrity. Extreme utilitarianists even think that the end justifies any mean. Again, in extreme cases, killing people might be good or bad, ethical or unethical, depending on the consequences that follow. That sounds crazy, because let's think back to deontology. Killing can never become a universal law, and the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights clearly states in Article 3 that all humans have the right to life. So let's get back to utilitarianism. Some of the most famous utilitarianists include Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. While the principle of utilitarianism sounds very, very simple, an act is good if it promotes the welfare of society as a whole by minimizing harm and maximizing benefits, it actually becomes rather difficult once you start considering all possible alternatives. And I cannot stress this enough. You can't just look at an act in isolation. You have to look at it as a whole. What other ways could I possibly act to? Can you achieve the same outcomes with less harm? Well, if so, the consequences no longer represent the greatest good for the greatest number. Utilitarianism is a very pragmatic approach. You first think of all possible alternatives, collect the available objective evidence, and create a balance sheet or cost-benefit type of calculation for each alternative. On the one side, you list all positive outcomes. And on the other hand, you write all negative outcomes. Well, now you have 10 different alternatives, or 5. Each tells you the net outcome and the scenario that results in the best consequences is the ethical one. But that means that no action in itself is ever absolutely right or wrong. It all depends on the consequences and the alternatives that are available to you. Child labor is a great example. There are numerous benefits to child labor, such as working children can help to reduce labor shortages. Right now, farmers face the problems that immigrant workers cannot come to Canada. Should we send our children who can't go to school to the fields? In addition, owners can reduce the cost of production. That means produce will be cheaper. Parents can use their children in family business. Poor children can work to pay tuition fees. And children can contribute to the family income. That all sounds great, doesn't it? But does that mean that utilitarianism sees child labor as ethical? Well, probably not. I only focused on potential positive outcomes and neglected to list the negative outcomes or any alternatives. In order to assess whether child labor is truly ethical or unethical, we would have to list all possible alternatives. For each alternative, come up with the pros and the cons, and then we could conclude. As you can imagine, utilitarianism has a lot of problems. First of all, we need to make judgments about the likely consequences of our actions. And how do we know what the actual consequences are? What are the outcome of child labor? Do you know how the child is truly affected in the long run? What are the potential alternatives? There are millions and millions of alternatives available. And even if we know the consequences, individuals still vary greatly on how they evaluate the outcomes, making the assessment very, very subjective. If you have to sacrifice one life to save 100 people, whose life is more important? The life of a business ethics professor like myself, or, let's not go down that road. As Michael from the show The Good Place once said, life now is so complicated. It is impossible for anyone to be good enough for the good place. These days, just buying a tomato at the grocery store means that you are unwittingly supporting toxic pesticides, exploiting labor, contributing to global warming. Human thinks that they are making one choice, but they're actually making dozens of choices, and they don't even know that they make those choices.